So what did you think of this one, the GDPR one?
I have some notes. What did you guys want to start?
Rose, did you have any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of comments.
Okay, please.
I just think it's interesting to think about it from a legal perspective, right? Because it brings up a lot of the things that we've been talking about like the purpose of something and the what something is going to be used for, what a particular model is going to be used for. And I think a lot of the problems that we've been talking about is that a model is put in place to do something with a particular set of data. And a lot of the people who are impacted by the result of the model have no visibility of how the model was created, who chose what elements were going to go into the data, and who was excluded from the data collection process. And I feel like this paper kind of approaches it with almost assuming that the model is correct and just presenting the counterfactual as represented within the model, and never actually goes back and addresses like what happens when the model does not actually reflect reality. And that starts to then snowball because you lock groups of people out of certain things, right? If somebody can't get a loan, then they can't buy a house, they can't start to accumulate wealth. And so I thought it was very interesting going through it, but I feel like their solution of just using the counterfactual as we're just going to tell you what the model said and find you a similar. That's not really that helpful. And once the model is deployed, I think it just leads us down a very dangerous path as far as I'm concerned.
Fair comment. So I had several comments. One of them related to what you're saying is I had a problem with the distance, the idea of distance. Mm-hmm. For who? For what? Oh, okay, well, we'll get around the problem by measuring lots of little distances, and we'll give you a picture menu of things that you can choose from. Yeah, pretty weak. And the other thing I found strategically wrong is that they're trying to justify a decision that's already been made. Mm-hmm. I think, so this is the difference between prediction and minimizing regret, in my opinion. When they present the counterfactuals to you, your assessment of those counterfactuals is to minimize the regret. Oh, I nearly got there, but I was so close on that particular dimension. Whereas I think prediction's much better. So essentially, I would much prefer a system that says, in a non-nasty way, you can speculate saying, so if I had this income and I was here and so on, would I pass the test? And and it gives you an assessment that says, yes. So that's a prediction, not, so there's no regret because you haven't tried. And so if you can essentially, if you don't actually have a failure case, and you just essentially iterate towards meeting the criteria, and then when you meet the criteria, you're accepted, I think that has a much more positive psychological impact than failing and then trying to make people feel better that they failed.
Well, I think in a way what you're almost doing is that the prediction would then give you an intervention that you could take, and then at least you have the power to experiment with that intervention. It's like, oh, if I pull this lever, does it actually change things for me?
Exactly. And now there's no regret, right? Because you haven't lost anything, right? You haven't tried and failed, because the mark of regret is that you failed, and it's noted that you have failed. Mm-hmm. And that's held against you. My daughter had an attempt at university that didn't go well for reasons that had nothing to do with university. It was purely personal. But the fact that she kind of bounced off is now a scar that she has to carry, which is silly, because the reasons, if you will, the explanation as to why she didn't do well wasn't that she was stupid or wasn't paying attention. Something else happened in her life that took her off course. So yeah.
I guess credit score is a good example of that too, right? Like having your credit score checked, then right. It ends up. having a
Yes.
negative impact upon your credit score.
Yes.
And so if you have to try multiple places, then you're.
Yeah, so to try and draw this as a kind of a splitting reality thing, counterfactuals are a different future that started earlier in the past, if you will. So I took this trajectory. A counterfactual trajectory was that I was going over here, whereas prediction, I'm here, and all the predictions are still in my future. So I don't have to try and change course, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was kind of my 2 cents. Robert, what did you think?
I'll share my screen a little bit. 1 second.
No problem. But the distance problem is a huge problem because distances are measured differently by different agents, right? So
papers. Yeah, so again, I'm really just trying to kind of get a good intuition for what explanations are and how I can be formal about them.
okay, sure.
Yeah, it was interesting kind of seeing. It's interesting seeing this about in terms of the GDPR because I don't know. I was kind of I don't know. I think when I see things that have to do with the law, like part of me is just like, yes, that's not my thing. I'm not going to really focus on that. And then, but I'm realizing like it's highly relevant because like there's a lot of legislation happening around AI now, and it seems that a lot of that legislation is focusing on the explainability of algorithms. So I'm like, I think this was I'm sharing the right screen. Like, I'm not sure.
Wow. Good
This
Lord.
was, yeah. Oh, this is wrong. This is 2013. I'm trying to find. I saw it on Twitter. It was like a legislating. Goes EU or what was because it was something about Beijing. That was recent. Oh shoot, I don't know. So like there was something. So there was something recent in some law regulating AI in Europe that seems to be like defining algorithms like anything that like it was basically legislating things that was anything that was using Bayesian statistics, which is like, wow, really?
Exactly. Wow, really? What? How does that work? Like what genius came up with let's throw Bayesian out the window? Some statistician who comes from
the EU are not planning to regulate Bayesian inference in general sense. They're planning to regulate the use of AI techniques in certain contexts, such as law enforcement. So I just was
like the devil in the details is kind of just really captures all of that, right? Like,
so they're basically saying it's a Bernoulli distribution, right? It's all or nothing. There's no wow.
Yeah, so I'm not. I can't. I won't waste our time. I'm just kind of log. Yeah, but anyway, there was just came up in Twitter last week, and something about something happening in the law in Europe. But so it's important stuff. So I mean, this is kind of like these two papers. I started scanning the second paper, which actually has some good summaries.
It does. It's very good. Yes.
Let's see here. So here we're at this. Here's this idea. I think we've seen it elsewhere, but seeing it hit again here kind of drives it again. But rather, like, is the purpose of an explanation to answer a why question, or is it to so in other words, to help understand, or is it supposed to guide some sort of, is it supposed to serve some kind of goal, right? So like, if the latter is true, if it's supposed to serve a goal, and I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer to it, but like, but that definition changes things, right? So like if an explanation answers a why question, that's one thing. If the explanation serves a goal, then as they say here, the scope and content of the explanation would be defined in terms of that goal. That's interesting. So it means, to me, I'm thinking like, oh, okay, so is this like a decision theory problem? Or is, in other words, like, is there, if I'm trying to come up with an explanation, say algorithmically, does it need to be defined in terms of some kind of reward function or something like that? Or is it just, some kind of operation on the specific execution of an algorithm, and just saying, what salient parts of the algorithm occurred such that gives you a very good understanding of why the algorithm came to a specific outcome. So in terms of the goal being to assist the individuals who are being subjected to the algorithmic decision makings, they outline 3 kind of aims here: to inform and help the subject understand why a decision was reached, provide grounds to contest adverse decisions, and to understand. So here's answering why. Here is so a goal in providing kind of legal recourse. Another one, kind of presuming kind of, I guess, an action recourse. So like, for example, recently, like I said, I applied to some program. They rejected me. They didn't tell me why. And it occurs to me they can't tell me why, because if they did, then I might sue them because I don't like the answer. They might give me something that I might use against them. So that's like legal recourse. And we might pass a law that says like, yeah, sorry, you got to provide people with explanations.
Those explanations would be heavily biased by minimizing the regret, right? To essentially, they would be heavily biased to minimize the chance of litigation against the provider of the explanation.
If somebody didn't hire me for a job because I was Black or because I was, in my 30s, then they wouldn't tell me that because they wouldn't want to because that would be illegal.
Right, so they would go down that list.
They would just lie.
But they would go down their list of possible answers and then come up with ones that, oh, it's Tuesday. Oh, we're full. Oh, somebody who we can't talk about got a better score than you.
I suppose, if you could, if an algorithm could make a decision about you in a way that was grounds for legal recourse, then they simply want to use the algorithm. That's almost to understand how. So, and this is the kind of algorithmic recourse. So it's like, all right, great, you rejected me. Like, of all the reasons that I was rejected, here's some that I can change. For example, my credit score, I can, get a job and pay my credit card bills on time for a year or something like that. Right.
Can we go back to those a second, Robert? Just like if you think about it, like a specific use case, like the credit thing, right? To inform and help the subject. Okay, so we didn't give you a loan because you've got a low credit score, and you're like, I have a low credit score. Like, I don't have a loan. Like, what's this about, right? Then you go on and you find like, oh, like there's been identity theft here and there's all this debt that's associated with me that is not my debt. Like, how do I even go about fixing that?
That literally happened to my parents.
Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time. Yeah, like and it's happening more and more to people, whereby the representation of you, which might have nothing to do with reality, but it basically enforces what's going to happen in your life, right? And so if you don't have a way to be able to change that, and then like to David's point, the very fact now that I have applied for something and been rejected, that then basically starts to feed that loop of like, oh, you're a bad credit risk. You have all of this thing associated with you, all of this debt associated with you, and now we're denying you further credit, right? If you don't have a mechanism to try and fix that and fix the system's representation of you, your future is not going to be good, right?
Reminds me of when during September 11th, there's these people who just disappeared. Like they, according to because some of these people kind of came forward under anonymously, but they said that after September 11th, they just pretended to be one of the victims. So like, it's not like you recognize bodies, but like, so they would, I just walked away and kind of started a new life as a John Doe because they were under such a mountain of debt and obligation and burned bridges that it was a chance.
Restart. Interesting.
So it's this issue of like reality versus a representation of reality. And I think we're at a place in the system where there's still some ability to do something about the representation of you. But we're quickly coming to the point that if we continue to increase automation and don't provide people a way, like if you can't talk to somebody about it and you're in with a chatbot and the chatbot is just keeps like basically saying to you over and over again, you're a poor credit risk or whatever. Like how do you break out of that and come back to reality? And so, like they mentioned at one point, like again, the things we talked about, like sufficiency and relevance, like some of the stuff might not even be sufficient or relevant to answer the question as a whole, but a model might use it. And that's where like a lot of the stuff that we talk about is counterfactual, where you have a causal model that you're testing against reality, and hopefully you have a couple of different surrogate metrics in place to make sure that the whole thing is congruent. That's very different from like just putting a predictive model out there that can make decisions about things that may be based on things that are neither sufficient nor relevant.
So I guess this gets into the difference between stochasticity and intent, right? So is it just being stochastic and it's just randomly jittering the results just to provide some entropy to essentially overcome bias? So it kind of jitters things around. That seems like a useful thing to do, but maybe not.
Well, I guess
I mean, if I didn't get into a good university because some random little jitter that pushed me under the threshold, I don't know if I'd be pleased with that.
No, you wouldn't.
You wouldn't be.
No.
And like in this situation, like the example I'm giving, let's say you've had like perfect credit your whole life. It's suddenly inconsistent that there's this debt that's being built up that is not consistent with your past history. Like yet you have no way to wipe that from the system.
Perfect memory is a big problem, yes. Yeah, that's a really big problem in the digital age.
This idea of closest possible world, like this is something that I've seen in machine learning literature, particularly when it comes to kind of continuous latent representations, because you just kind of say, find a distance and then kind of find something that's closest on the other side of the decision threshold.
We did a paper about that a couple of weeks ago, right? Where they were using this, or maybe you and I watched a video.
Yeah, no, I watched the lady on it. This is the difference between prediction.
No, it wasn't her. There was another one, maybe it was probably a month ago or longer, where they were.
So the algorithmic recourse paper did have some.
Yes.
But it's way, like if you look at some of how the machine learning literature, because in deep learning it's all about like continuous representations, right? And so it's just like, so imagine you have some kind of so you got some kind of classification problem, you map it back to some continuous latent space and feature space, and you kind of you define a decision boundary somewhere in there where, so if you're on the no side of that boundary, you figure out like, all right, well, let's figure out what the closest point is on the yes side of the boundary, and then what are the features
Mhm.
corresponding to that yes. And so like that's the closest possible world idea.
Mhm.
I think reading this paper made me think like, oh right, like well, for one thing, they kept saying that so firstly, it made me realize like actually like the kind of Perlian exogenous variable thing is kind of close, because we're talking about closeness of possible worlds in terms of overlap of exogenous variables.
Mhm.
That was the first time I made that connection in my head. Also, they keep saying that closest possible world corresponding to a range of diverse counterfactuals corresponding to relevant and informative close possible worlds, rather than the closest possible world, may be more helpful. Did they ever really get into why?
Oh, so I think they talk later about presenting a diverse range of interventions you could take to change it, because sometimes some of the things might actually not be mutable, or
Yeah.
there might be a dependence between two things. Like, for example, if you change your profession to increase your income, right? You can't.
That paper on algorithmic recourse probably handled. That's what I was thinking. But I was like, oh, when I saw that, I was thinking, okay, well, that paper from Max Planck on algorithmic recourse has a much more sophisticated take on that.
Yeah, I think this is just
this is actually quite simplistic. I would agree. Yes.
And the existing explanation typically refers to an attempt to convey. So these two papers kind of, I'm really talking about the difference between with the other paper here, they call interpretation, right? So they define interpretability as the degree of human comprehensibility of a black box algorithm.
Right.
And so that is one. Some people are calling that explanation, but I think calling that interpretability is better than explanation. Explanation is this is a really clear, crisp. Numerous ways of exchanging information about a phenomenon. In this case, the functionality of the model or the rationale and criteria for a decision to different stakeholders. So there's an agent involved. Where there's no agent involved here. So we have people that we need to explain things to. We have different things that you might want to explain, the functionality, in this case, which is closer to interpretability, but also the rationale and the criteria for the decision. So yeah, I'm liking this nuance here, kind of highlighting kind of how people kind of think about machine learning. What this paper is essentially saying is that, well, we don't actually need to know the internal states to provide explanations. I think that's simplistic in the sense that, like if you plug me into an algorithm and it says, reject, well then you can just kind of play around with my inputs until it's accept, right, and then just figure out, because like it's an algorithm, you can replay that. But if for example, the kind of structural kind of questions we were asking in the course, like I married my wife when I was in my early 20s. Well, how would things have worked out had I married somebody else, or had I waited, or whatever? Like there's no algorithm for me to plug that into, right? Like it's but great. So that actually kind of, we don't need it. Maybe this paper is right in the sense that we don't need to go into all that structural causal modeling stuff in the case of algorithms, because we actually can, we actually know what the algorithm would have done in other situations by simply plugging in those situations. So I mean, it's an important. I mean, whether or not that's sufficient is one question, but it certainly.
I think it comes back to that question of what is the intent of the algorithm? Because I think often what happens is an algorithm is put in place for one purpose, right? But then it sort of grows from there, and it has a far wider impact than we might necessarily initially realize, right? Like, especially when you think now about like individual companies using data that they have about you for a specific relationship. But then that data is then being collected by some other data gatherer and being used for some other entirely different purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it's being, I think when there's full transparency of this is why, like, you are going to loan me money. Here's the agreement we're making between us, and you have to evaluate your risk. That's one thing. But when that is being taken and used to make a decision by somebody else entirely, where they might not have all of the correct data.
Yeah.
They're missing data basically, and they don't even know it.
Or they have incorrect information, or their algorithm has a bug in it, or
right.
I mean, these things happen. These are just algorithms, not magic. So,
they talk a lot, like at the end of the paper, about what are the responsibilities of the data collector, and it's interesting because it's legal stuff, right? So a lot of it comes down to what is the bare minimum that we can get away with, and how close to the absolute boundary of the intention here can we push it in order to avoid some of the obligations. And so like they talk about like making the data subject aware of the data that's being collected about them and how it's being used, and that like just updating the privacy policy on the website is perfectly adequate. But again, if you've given your data over for one particular purpose with a privacy policy at one point in time, and then it's subsequently updated, and that data is going to be used for some other purpose entirely, right? It just feels like the legal system in general is sort of set up that allows the people who have the most resources to manipulate the system so that they can benefit the most, and people who have the least resources don't have the ability to maximize the system.
Yeah, understood. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's getting into kind of like.
So Robert, when you say you're interested in this in terms of algorithmic recourse or in terms of machine learning, what's your interest? I'm curious. Like, what do you want to do with this stuff? Maybe that's a better way of kind of approaching this. Are you just generally interested in how it's done and will keep that in mind when you face similar situations, or do you have a specific kind of goal that you're trying to get to?
Yeah, I suppose I would like to. So I'm curious about technically how you implement it.
I see. Okay, that's fine.
But I'm also curious about what kinds of problems one could solve. And all the in some of the kind of Pearl Halpern papers, they kind of show some very rudimentary causal models that where and where you could have where Halpern's definition of actual causality could help you kind of produce an answer to a question that humans would produce in psychological studies. I suppose I'm trying to figure out what's the killer app, and I don't have an intuition for it yet. I think, but that's I'm probably getting ahead of myself there. Like right now, I'm just trying to understand, like, kind of what it is, like Halpern's, like, so for example, like this definition of explanation feels like this is what I kind of hear, like in terms of application, this is what I kind of get from Pearl, like that, like, so law and ethics scholars have been concerned with understanding the internal logic of decisions as a means to assess their lawfulness. So this is like that legal recourse, right? Like contest them, increase their accountability, clarify liability. You know, when Halpern talks about responsibility and blame, this is what I think he's getting at, and that's important. I think that there is probably some I think what really gets me excited is the ability to kind of write an algorithm that can do something with symbolic code, like, readable code, and if and it's not kind of done in many lines, right? Like just like a simple code that can do a kind of reasoning that it's very hard to do without essentially knowing the answer in advance and training your loss function on that answer. And so like but I don't really know what that looks like.
So on that topic, one of the things I'm interested in doing when I'm finished my current project is to reimagine the simulator that I've been building, and to try and introduce some sort of genetic system to see if I can get, well, tribalism is a strong word, but essentially to see if the agents will see if I can coerce the agents into forming into clusters based on signaling their beliefs about certain things in the simulation. So I'm curious to see if I can essentially set up the conditions under which we have an emergent behavior in the agents whereby they segregate themselves into groups based on their beliefs. So that's what I'm interested in from that perspective. So that is quite a simple algorithm. I'm not going to try and put incredible sophistication into that. I'm just going to try and come up with a genetic system. This is based on evolutionary game theory, whereby the agents essentially form themselves into clusters, and they can discriminate each other when they encounter each other by signaling to each other their beliefs about certain things, and based on the distance between those explanations, the agents form an assessment of distance, essentially distance and belief between themselves and the other agents. But the other thing I'm trying to work on is to see if I can actually get the beliefs themselves to be essentially ephemeral and emerge from the system. But it's very.
So you're not setting up a number of categories at the beginning, like you're not saying what the right.
Right. I'm trying to see if I can actually get the categories themselves to emerge stochastically. I'm curious about the mechanism. So that doesn't give me an algorithm I can use in the real world, but it answers some fundamental questions I have about why
I think you need leaders and followers.
Well, there has to be an evolutionary advantage to one group to hold certain beliefs over another group, right? Anyway, sorry, separate topic, I guess, but yeah. So to me, explanations are a consequence of this, where one agent is trying to move into a new group and that group is rejecting that agent from entering that group based on certain criteria. And what causes those criteria to emerge, and what is the benefit of rejecting agents and not just accepting all agents? Right? So, and what is the cost of accepting poor agents versus good agents? It's the efference-afference problem. So, anyway.
Why do you feel like there has to be an evolutionary benefit to doing that? Could it not just be that we automatically keep splitting into smaller categories? Like we start by splitting into two, and then we split into, and it just keeps happening.
Because we don't have giant monolithic superorganisms that don't keep splitting, there has to be an advantage to splitting. Otherwise, we would have, anyway, it's a kind of it's not a very strong argument, but Yeah, basically, because we don't have systems in the world that don't do this constant splitting and this constant rejection of, you know, the efferents, are you me or are you them kind of thing. I'm just interested in trying to understand the machinery by which it emerges. And if we, my goal is that if we can understand the machinery by which it emerges, we can potentially have stronger medicine to counter the effect, or at least understand the effect and try and minimize the damage that it does, perhaps. I don't know.
Recommend this book.
Which book?
The
Religious Case Against Belief. Oh, that sounds great. Sure. I'll see if I can get that on Kindle. One sec. I'll do that right now.
But see if I can find. Kars is a very interesting philosopher, like religious philosopher. I think he's maybe NYU. But he has, I mean, he's talking mostly about religion, but I mean, I think, you know, insofar as organized religion is just a very large, is, you know, kind of modern monotheistic religion is really just kind of a higher order of a kind of traditional affinity group. But like, you're kind of pointing out that that's the people's belief systems are defined in opposition to other groups' belief systems, right? And that and so it's not that, you know, so this is why, for example, in religion, like when people people within a religious group characterize the enemy is usually not atheists, but rather people who are like them, but believe in something, but differ with them on some fundamental point. So he gives the example of a conflict between Martin Luther and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V.
And I mean, that happens in belief systems across, like even outside of religion, right? Like if
right. That's why
any conflicts, it's always like the person right next to you.
Right.
Yeah, so if you look at, you know, in terms of what Martin Luther believed, the totality of what he believed and what the Pope believed, they're like 98% the same. It's that 2% that you know, makes all the difference. And so I imagine the same thing is true with affinity groups, with you know, identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the same with banks. Like, oh, we don't want you to be part of our tribe, right? Sorry, you know, we only want people who will guaranteed pay us, you know, so we can actually make our profit. So we are going to be discriminatory. We're not going to let, you know, any old Joe come up and borrow money off us. No way. So they're essentially creating a condition of bias that improves their chance of success. And so by rejecting entrance into the tribe of a certain type, it essentially improves their evolutionary outcomes. And so that's what I'm
that's true. I think like business, I think it's, you know, because I think the kind of structure of companies has changed. I think that like you know, people used to go to a company and work there until they died.
Yeah.
And there's a lot less affinity to corporations these days, perhaps more at the top. My suspicion is that people in companies might exclude somebody, you know, say, you know, for the sake of, you know, ass covering. Ass covering is a big motivation for everybody who's not incentivized purely on the bottom line. Most people aren't incentivized on the bottom line. They're incentivized on checking certain boxes off, and so they have no incentive to do anything that could be interpreted as you know. So, for example, like if if there's some kind of ethnicity that nobody lends to, and you do the math and you realize, well, this person has, this person's clearly going to pay us back, and it's going to be, there's this, they have excellent credit, and they're not asking, relative to their wealth, they're not asking for a lot, and it's just like a no-brainer. But if you do that deal and it's successful, it's just another deal that you did. It's not like you're getting it. If you're a lender, you're not incentivized for how many mortgages you close usually. But if that person does not repay, and then somebody audits your accounts and says, "Hey, you loaned to this non-traditional loan applicant, and lo and behold, they didn't pay. What the hell were you thinking?" So this is that kind of thinking dominates a lot in business.
Right.
I think
so. If you feel like you're part of that institution or tribe, then and there's a benefit to you for staying there, then you'll move from a position of trying to benefit the tribe as a whole to minimizing the regret so that you don't get rejected. And you assume that other agents in the company are actually going out there and making the money. You're just kind of hiding inside, minimizing regret, not being fired each day. And by not being fired each day, you as an individual gain advantage in that you get your monthly paycheck, but you're not actually benefiting the host at all. And so that's actually a kind of parasitism, which is actually unhealthy for the host. But for some reason, it emerges time and time again, exactly as you say. I'm not disagreeing with you. So what is the benefit? Like, why evolutionary do we have such immense parasitism within these organizations, and how can they sustain such a heavy load?
It's you're talking about tribal membership in two very different ways when you're talking about that. Like, there's employee of a company, and then there's somebody outside applying for a loan, and those two relationships.
So they're trying to pass through the membrane to get from the outside to the inside. They're trying to go from one of them to one of us.
Right. But I guess my point is that a lot of the time, I think we're trying to have a transaction, and you just want to complete the transaction, actually. It's not that you want to become part of the tribe. Like, I feel like
I'm not sure. The bank example also feels a bit stretched to me. I think kind of more traditional tribes, like, a country club, or
right.
I guess I feel like what's starting to happen, though, is that we're being put in categories and tribes that we never really wanted to even be a part of. Like, there's almost a sort of ownership, like in politics, when you like declare a side, or like having a number of accounts or something gives a bank a certain amount of power, even though, like, you might have no real affiliation to that. Like, right, you have an account and there's $100 in it or something, right? Like, you're not truly wanting to be part of that tribe, but it feels like there's an ownership being taken of individuals that is a representation of power, right? Like the number of users you have or something. Whereas I think the actual user a lot of the time is like, yeah, I'm not part of that tribe. Like, I just wanted this transaction, or I wanted that piece of information, or do you see what I'm?
Sorry, a kind of instantaneous, yeah. So the way I had a different mechanic, I'll just throw it out there. I'm not trying to derail the thread here. So the way I thought about it was that you could have a webcam in the corner of your room, and then you could essentially go about your day. And at the end of the day, the webcam would say, you were a good person today. You did the dishes, and you made the bed, and you didn't, did this and did that. So you were a good person today. It doesn't mean you're a good person forever. It just means you're a good person on that day. And so you can claim membership of the good person tribe for that day, but tomorrow's a new day, and you may not be a good person tomorrow. So this kind of instantaneous assessment. So there's this idea of memory in that, well, you employed me. I am now an Uber employee. I'm not just Uber wants to forget you, right? The minute that you close the app and you stop being an Uber driver, they just want to forget you. They want you to go away and not have anything to do with Uber until the next time you fire up the app. But the government's saying, no, no, you're an employee, in that just by the mere fact that you opened the app and you drove some people around, you're now an employee of the company. And you now have, healthcare benefits and union rights and all this other stuff. And, you opened an app and it told you to go here and pick up this guy and drive him over there. And now all of a sudden you've got healthcare coverage. It's very poorly defined area. And so I think that creating simple models that can emulate this behavior would give us a powerful tool for, seeing what interventions might have actual benefit. Sorry, Robert, I'm kind of off topic here, but.
No. Should we take you where you want to go? I guess one last thing I wanted to bring up about the paper was this. So I mean, the paper kind of defining counterfactuals in terms of, well, oh, is that you?
That's me. That's probably just me.
One second.
I'm still listening.
Yeah.
Right. So if it says if P were false, S would not believe that P. Well, no, that's sensitivity, but rather.
No, they do get into it a little bit. It's good. No, I understand. Yes, this is exactly what I was trying to get at.
This concept, if Q were false, Q were false, the subject would not believe the proposition.
Right.
So, so this concept kind of, so instead of saying, so Q is true. So like the kind of traditional counterfactual is that if Q were false, P would be false. But no, we're saying something different. We're saying if Q were false, S would not believe P were true. And so introducing the agent S here and then talking about their beliefs instead of talking about the actual causal relationship between Q and P. That's a new thing.
That's exactly what I'm trying to get to. Yes, this is very much the stuff I'm interested in. Yes.
I'm not really sure what to do with this. I'm just going to file it away, but it seems interesting. This idea of, trying to see my notes here.
I should start taking notes.
I think that's kind of related to the sufficiency and relevancy too. Right? It's the difference between belief based upon a particular model as opposed to true causal, validated causal model, right? The way we sort of think about it, where we've tried to falsify the model against reality.
This gets back to that book that Robert was. Sorry, I didn't catch the name of the book, Robert, and I couldn't find it on Audible. So can you just mention the book to me one more time, and I'll type it into.
The Religious Case Against Belief by James Carse. He's got a more popular book of his is called what's it called? Open Games or Unlimited Games, or.
I'll check it out. That's great. Thank you. I found it. Yeah. James Carse. Got it. Cool.
Yeah, he's got another book, Finite
and Infinite Games.
That's a great book.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Although,
thank you.
I wish it was written with more precise language, but
that's a bit fluffy. Okay.
I mean, he's a theologian. I don't imagine.
No, that's fine. I'm game.
He's going to use symbolic language or symbolic logic.
It's just, like a lot of, I mean, just a lot of the logic kind of very loosey-goosey. But
it comes from theology, that has a long history of its own that I've looked somewhat into in the philosophy literature, but yeah.
Right, like because you're thinking like, wow, this feels a lot like kind of something you might read about. So a finite game is one where the game ends, and at the end of the game, there are winners and losers. Well, and so the objective of play is to win. And an infinite game is one where the objective of play is to prolong the game and avoid avoid the game reaching an end.
Yes.
And so it has some interesting kind of philosophy of life implications. It uses kind of a lot of examples of real life things, like, you know, buying a nice house, kind of, or becoming a member of some, you know, elite group. Those are finite games.
Yeah.
You know, like ideas like, you know, when you play a finite game, you adopt a role, and you take and the role and the role everybody has to kind of take seriously, like, or else the game falls apart. So like if I'm, you know, so like, anyway, and, you know, other things like, you know, the accolades for winning also, if like it's a threat if people don't respect them. So if, for example, like I play the finite game of going to a nice university and getting a nice degree and becoming recognized as a professional who can, with certain credentials, if people undermine those credentials, then it's a threat to me. You know, stuff like, you know, a lot of interesting ideas like that. Anyway,
we talked about the utility, like optimizing the utility function, like in that context before, right? Like that if you're just optimizing for the next step, as opposed to optimizing for the overall game. And it's like sometimes it's hard to know what the right optimization function is when you kind of open things out a little bit more. Like when we're just trying to answer one question, it might be really easy to come up with a good utility function, but that might not be the same best utility function for the overall system.
Or for other agents specifically.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's part of what I'm interested in.
In the infinite game idea, like,
Yeah.
people who play an infinite game would be willing to, are often willing to die in order to preserve the game. So there's a certain kind of selflessness, you know. Anyway.
Interesting. No, I'll definitely read it. Thank you. No, I'll definitely take that one.
It's a quick one too, I think. And so it's finite infinite you can definitely find on Audible. Unfortunately, the religious case against belief, you cannot.
Okay.
So it's here. Explanation. So this book is very nice in its definition. So it was this paper. Sorry, like this.
This was the second read.
This is the second paper. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's a good paper. It's very short, actually. It's only like 10 pages. It's good.
So do you leave this still feeling like explanation is explicitly for a particular audience for a particular purpose?
I'm starting to come around to that idea.
Yeah.
Pearl's idea of explanation is just kind of like some operation on a causal model. Just didn't feel like it was enough. Because, you know, the cog scientists are saying, like, you know, there's interlocutors who have to be considered. And so, like, I guess I'm trying to understand, you know, and there's also this idea of explaining why versus understanding why versus supporting some goal. And, you know, like that to me, you know, if it's one, you know, one thing that decision theory tells you, it's like, you know, inferring the point value of a parameter is different from optimizing the decision that you make based on that inference. And so that distinction probably plays here. But anyway, I'm still figuring it out. Just trying to understand.
So how does
why we care? Like, why do I care? Why do I care about? I mean, I don't know. Explaining why an algorithm did something, that's great and everything, but I want to write an algorithm that can explain things to itself so that it can do things. I guess I need to, you know, I'm talking to Tania Lombroso, whose papers we've read a few of, trying to get her to come onto a call with other members of our community, and we can maybe just pick her brain, like, yeah, I want to know, like, what what I can do, either as a data scientist or as an engineer of reasoning agents with some formal model of explanation that I can't do with other existing methods, and I don't know what that is. It's kind of starting to bum me out.
Oh, really? I'm sorry.
I mean, I think we're just at a rough place, right? Where we're just sort of seeing how if you misapply, like you try do one thing with a model that's being designed to do the other thing, you're going to end up in the wrong place. And I feel like that last paper that we read last week just sort of talks about like you really need to think through all that stuff, and there's benefit to both. I really like where I think you described it in the end, Robert, is that like prediction is kind of table stakes. If you can't predict, then you're basically just telling a nice story. But prediction by itself doesn't really give you an awful lot, because you're going to want to do some intervention based upon the prediction. And if you can't explain why, then the intervention goes nowhere, right? You're basically predicting, but what are you going to do about it? You want to be able to control in some way too. And that means an intervention is required. And the only way to define a good intervention is if you understand the why. Why did the prediction come about? Or what components of the system are working together to make this happen?
I had a slightly different interpretation of that, in which the black box predictions can be very, very good, but they can predict the future amazingly well, but they don't offer any kind of grasp of anything that I can use to change the prediction, right? I might, click my fingers, that'll change prediction. I might, go on some great journey and build some great thing to change the prediction. It's not clear, right? It's a very good prediction because it's got 12 million, GPT-3 is really good at predicting the next word, but I don't know what I can do to change what that next word might be. It's just unknown to me. So, this thing is an agent that I don't understand or can communicate with or have any impact on. Like it's foreign to me. I'm trying to talk to a duck. And that's a problem, right? So yes, you can have amazing predictive power in these billion parameter models, but it doesn't actually help you.
Yeah,
it just tells you you're going to die. And it's just like, what can I do about it? I have no idea.
Yeah, I would love to be able to say, go to open, take GPT-3 and say, hey, GPT-3, here is some meaning that I want to convey. Like, here's an answer that I want to give, and here are the keywords, and here are, here's a bunch of information that basically all you need. If I gave this to a human, they'd be able to string together a coherent answer using these, using this representation. Mm-hmm. How do I create that interface for GPT-3? I can't.
No clue. So
anyway, I have to hop off.
Okay.
Yeah. You guys can stay.
Robert, before you go, can you look at the personal messages on Slack? I sent you a message about inviting somebody to Alt Deep.
Oh, sure.
Thank you.
Please. Thanks for that.
Okay.
All right, cool. Take care. We'll see you
soon.
Bye,
guys. See you next week.
Bye.